Susan Firestone. I'm a retired patent attorney and I live in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
My name is Lester Brooks. I teach in the history department at Anne Arundel Community College in Maryland.
I'm Tim Moore. I'm from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers.
If you can introduce yourselves.
Hello, we are Unit 2 from Staples High School in Westport, Connecticut. My name is Christian Wadwani.
My name is Aiden Rogers.
I'm Allie Schwartz, and this is our teacher, Mrs. Cameraman.
Okay. We have question number 1 today. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? And you may begin.
American historian Richard Hofstadter said the founding fathers' image of themselves as moderate Republicans standing between political extremes was quite accurate. Assembling delegates with varying stances on representation, slavery, the Bill of Rights, and the president made compromise a prerequisite for ratification.
Due to the anticipated strength of the legislature, representation in Congress was heavily debated. James Wilson contextualized the debate by asking, quote, "Is this government for men or for the imaginary beings called states?" James Madison's Virginia plan favored the larger states with proportional representation in each chamber, while William Patterson's opposing New Jersey plan aimed support of the smaller states with equal representation of the states.
The Great Compromise resolved the issue by establishing proportional representation in the lower house and granted it the power to originate money bills, while delegating an equal vote for each state in the upper house. The original compromise, a book by David Bryan Robertson, argues that the delegates accepted the compromise because they feared any alteration would prolong the debate.
The delegates also considered multiple plans for the executive. The Virginia plan proposed a single executive with a 7-year term. The New Jersey plan offered a multi-member executive with 4-year terms. Controversially, New York delegate Alexander Hamilton suggested a single executive to serve for life. The delegates agreed upon a balance between the proposals, a single president serving a 4-year term and no defined term limit.
At the time of the convention, women, free black men, and non-property owning white men were counted in the census, determining taxation and house representation, but lacked suffrage. Slave-owning delegates argued slaves should be counted in the same fashion. In response, abolitionist Albert Sherry argued slaves were treated as cattle and should be excluded from the census. In the end, the state settled on the ratio of 3/5 as it balanced the interests of the South.
While representation of slaves was resolved, any restriction on the institution was impossible. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, the Slave Trade Clause, delayed the resolution of slavery and further embedded the institution into the United States. During the Virginia Ratifying Convention, Madison said, "Great as the evil is, a dismemberment of the Union would be worse."
The Constitution references citizenship as a requirement for representatives, but neglects to define the qualifications for a citizen. The consequences of this omission were highlighted in Dred Scott v. Sanford, when the Supreme Court established that no state can make a foreigner any other description of persons, citizens of the United States, nor entitle them to the rights and privileges secured to citizens. In this case, the ambiguity of citizenship denied Dred Scott the right to sue in court. It wasn't until the 14th Amendment that the Constitution established the qualifications for a citizen, then securing people's rights.
Even like James Madison felt the average citizen was not educated enough to know how to benefit the public good. The result of the Electoral College, a system unable to represent the diverse opinions of the United States. Tennessee Representative Steve Cohen introduced a resolution in the House this January to amend the Constitution by abolishing the Electoral College. The congressman said, quote, "The president should always be elected by the people, not the politicians." Over a century ago, we amended the Constitution to directly elect senators. It is past time to do so for the president and vice president.
Thomas Paine said, "The right of voting for representation is the primary right by which other rights are protected." While the 15th and 19th Amendments secured suffrage regardless of race or sex, the Constitution provides no explicit right to vote. In the United States, over 5.2 million ex-felons lack suffrage. A right to vote amendment, as proposed by Senator Dick Durbin in August of 2020, would grant the franchise to every citizen of the United States who is of legal voting age. This amendment is imperative to protect against voter suppression.
James Wilson argued the legislature ought to be the most exact transcript of the whole society, the faithful echo of the voices of the people. The Constitution must be changed to reflect the true demographics of the United States. Thank you. We are now ready for questioning.
If you mentioned that the convention kind of was a group of bargainers, wheeling and dealing, what would have made it less so to be this organization where they're sitting around wheeling and dealing?
At the time of the convention, there was a spirit of amity among the delegates. They understood past the articles that ratification was necessary. At the convention, the people that still supported the articles did not show up. The only parties that you had were people that thought it needed to be amended and those that thought it needed to be completely changed. So you had this spirit of amity and understanding that this was necessary and they would do anything possible to make sure that that happened. So these compromises were made in order to let this happen and to ensure that no one would back out because they felt their beliefs weren't represented.
I also think that it's really hard to say that we can have a political system in which there is no wheeling and dealing as worded, but I think the Constitution Convention does a good job of at least attempting this through something like the secrecy agreement, where they would not share what happened within the walls of the convention until like 30, 40, 50 years after.
Let me ask this. You talked about a single executive versus multi-executives. Have we grown to the point here in the 21st century that one executive cannot handle the job? What do you think?
I think there's certainly an argument that multiple executives certainly helps balance the many hats that the president has, right? We have to understand the president has to be a symbol for America as well as a foreign diplomat and the person in charge of the military. So yes, I think multiple executives would be valuable perhaps so that the president can split up his duties. So perhaps you have an executive that's purely in charge of foreign relations, and an executive that's purely in charge of executing the laws. And I think that is a valuable proposition. Yeah.
And a value element of having a single executive is the speed at which the president would be able to act. And we see this as both a positive and a negative, where the president can almost single-handedly declare war, as we've seen since World War II, where the Congress hasn't declared war. Instead, actions of the presidency have made war happen. But it can also be positive, where if the nation is in a state of emergency, where the president can act more swiftly without having to appease to other members of the executive.
Okay.
So you were talking about, just following up more, are you in favor of increasing the presidential power? Or do you think the Constitution actually adequately set up the presidency for the power the president has now versus back then?
Well, in creating the outline of the presidency, there is a little bit of an omission, because at the Constitutional Convention, we see that George Washington, who was the chair of the convention, was likely going to be the first president. And having that figure there, like proposing a limit on that job would be a direct call out to him. So we see that there isn't much of a limit on the presidency, and there's been severe increase in presidential power as time has gone on.
Presidential power has definitely expanded through the use of executive orders and vetoes. The president has gained almost full legislative power, which is not the intention of the framers, but the powers have definitely expanded of the executive.
Moreover, Arthur Schlesinger in the Imperial Presidency argues how the president, using war powers and the abilities given to him, has managed to expand the office. And to what Aidan was saying, the office was created for George Washington, a military general, and yet oftentimes that isn't who the president is. And so the problem is the office is made for a person who's only president for 8 years out of our 250-year history.
Let me propose. Let me propose something here. Let's say, should we have considered a second constitutional convention to evaluate the first constitutional convention's work?
So Patrick Henry, after the Virginia Ratifying Convention, was a tremendous supporter of this motion. So was the governor of New York at the time. And I think the problem with such a convention would simply be that it was crafted with the goal of weakening the Constitution as anti-federalists would want to see it. So to what Ali was saying earlier, anti-federalists in the most extreme form did not show up to the convention. And so they were fully unrepresented in the creation of the Constitution. However, we do have to recognize that the Constitution had to be strong in order to make up for the many flaws with something like the Articles of Confederation. And so a second constitutional convention would have undermined the necessary strength of a federal government.
Let's go back to Madison and this issue. Madison said that in order to preserve the Union, essentially let slavery go. Was that a mistake because of the future and the controversy surrounding slavery and the eruptions that it caused in this country? Was it a mistake to go ahead and preserve the Union instead of dealing with that issue at the time?
I think in terms of what we see in the next century, through the 19th century, through the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Civil War, which then turns into Jim Crow, which turns into civil rights, which turns into where we are now with racial tensions in this country, surely it had a long-standing impact, one that I don't even think he recognized would be the case. He understood that slavery was a polarizing enough issue that if they dealt with it, the country would have split up. And in the South, if you didn't have these abolitionist voices, maybe slavery could have even lasted longer, which is horrible to think about, but possible. And so I think Madison understood that it was that polarizing that he needed to push it off, but the impact of pushing it off has lasted to today.
Yeah, and as Ali touched on, if slavery was completely omitted from the Constitution, there might not have been a union at all, and the southern slave states and the northern states might have created their own unions, where in the southern states slavery could have been even further embedded and lasted even longer. So while it's not a favorable outcome to have certainly not a favorable outcome to have slavery be in the Constitution at all, it might have been necessary to eventually limiting it.
Okay, thank you.
You
Let me
mentioned,
ask you this. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Oh,
Go ahead.
no, I'm okay. Go.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think we should, I mean, we often look at the convention as this really righteous set of dudes, but what do you think about they were assigned to amend the articles and they don't do that? I mean, should we be critical of them for not doing their homework assignment?
Well, the articles were completely ineffective, and the amendment process of the articles was unanimous, which was impossible for change. So really, in reality, they did not have an option of amending the articles. That was not a possibility. So they did what was best for the country and ratified a constitution completely.
Thank you very much.
Really, Jen? You can't leave that down for a couple more minutes?
I know, I wanted more time, but thank you very much. We have some follow-up for you, Tim or Lester, just jump in there.
Lester, go ahead.
Okay, let me start off that your introduction was great. I love the reference to Hofstadter. I haven't heard his name in a while, and I remember reading him, and it's a good place to start. But you touched on a lot of good issues, certainly the Virginia, New Jersey plan, and you brought up the Great Compromise. You touched on the single executive and Elbridge Gerry and that issue of property. So that introduction, you touched on a lot of issues, not just the Constitution issues, but you brought up historical events as well. I think your follow-up questions was exciting. As you can see, we got into a fairly good conversation, and some of the answers, like a single executive as a symbol, the speed to act for a president, the impact of George Washington's presence with regard to terms. You even talked about Arthur Schlesinger and the imperial presidency. And so there was a lot that you hit on those follow-up responses. So very, very good job.
Thank
Tim?
you.
Yeah, Schlesinger. Yeah, I got that caught my attention too. You know, your history is really good. The fact that you know Patrick Henry and George Clinton are pushing for a second convention. I mean, I kind of baited you there, and you knocked that one out of the park. So I appreciate that. You also made reference to secrecy as being. I mean, this is what I think is really interesting. Hey, secrecy was a good idea, which at the time, all the newspapers said secrecy was absolutely wonderful. It's only the Anti-Federalists later that made a big deal out of that. So, I mean, the fact that you know some of the nuances of the history of the time really stands out to me. And also the fact that the Anti-Federalists were using that second convention not as a righteous argument. They wanted to derail it. So, I mean, that reveals, I think, a depth of reading and understanding that's really, really admirable. And, you know, the fact that you say, you know, the unresolved citizenship and we wind up with the crappiest decision ever in America, Dred Scott. I mean, those kinds of use of evidence is really revealing in a positive way. So I really enjoyed this session. But it also, in addition to enjoying this session, it was a very good session. So, you're to be commended. I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave.
I second my fellow judges on that. It was I also didn't want to end when we did, but unfortunately we have to. I also enjoyed the Dred Scott decision, but I also enjoy the fact that you mentioned about, you know, failure to say who is allowed to vote and who is not. And you brought up contemporary examples as well as the introduction of a bill to allow felons to vote. I would have been happier. You also mentioned that states used to be able to define the vote. At least people that were non-citizens voted all the time back, you know, 100 years ago. So because the states allowed them to do so. But I enjoyed it. It was really chock full of not only your presentation, but your responses were chock full of references. So you know your stuff. And I enjoyed our time together very much. You deserve a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.